At the end of this module, you should be able to understand what is the idea of coping from a positive psychological perspective, know the pros and cons of positive psychology approach of coping, know also how the coping process works, evaluate the process and the psychodynamic and transactional approach of coping, and also learn with the help of a model how we can learn to practically cope in our daily lives. Let's first understand what is the idea of positive psychology of coping. Let's first understand what does coping mean. Coping refers to a psychological mechanism of stress management in which the organism resorts to various strategies and employs the various available resources to deal with potential stressors. A stressor is a stimulus that threatens organism's equilibrium or his ability to deal with a threatening situation. In this way of coping, it is related to adjustment of the organism in a given environment, and it comes into action as soon as this adjustment or equilibrium is disturbed. Psychologists like Lazarus and Folkman have defined coping as the sum of cognitive and behavioral efforts which are constantly changing that aim to handle particular demands, whether internal or external, that are viewed as taxing or demanding. The definition focuses on the dynamism underlying coping process. It seems the word stress or stressor has been deliberately avoided in this definition, as coping is not necessarily evoked only where there is something called stressor. However, writers of coping literature seem to be highly obsessed with stress. Coping mechanism can be activated under any situation that is perceived as taxing or demanding and which may or may not necessarily fall into the category of a stressor. This positive psychology movement has touched almost every aspect of psychology and is gaining new followers with each passing day. However, it has also drawn concern from the many quarters for the same reason. We may call it as a new fad of psychology. On the foremost, spokesperson on stress and coping, Dr. Lazarus once raised concern over the too much focusing of positive psychology over the positive aspects of human endeavor, and he emphasized that though it is welcomed, but it should not occur at the cost of ignoring the so-called negative aspects of human behavior. It is true that we seek happiness, love, to be in the company of optimists and enjoy personal freedom. But anger, frustrations, struggles and sufferings make us much more than these positive aspects of life. Also, rather than just being a psychology and research subdiscipline, positive psychology has emerged as a big business over the years. The capitalist overtones and the fee that we pay for being happy and optimistic is gradually becoming, unfortunately, a new stressor. The stress has already got enough treatment in traditional, if not negative, psychology. And positive psychology has a big challenge and responsibility ahead of it to devise a truly positive coping mechanism for stress and such disintegrating experiences of life. There are many tasks ahead in the new positive psychology of coping, and should begin with how it says coping. Traditionally, it has been understood as a stress containing mechanism where we employ various strategies to contain and emerge, and I hope successfully, from the stressing experiences. Like many other psychological attributes, traditionally, coping was also considered to be determined partly by natural endowments and partly by environmental factors. Some of the differences between the traditional approach to coping and positive psychological approach of coping need to be understood before we move ahead. There's a difference in the approach to issue. The traditional approach takes a more reductionist approach to coping, where both cause and effect can be understood in terms of smaller units or mechanisms. Whereas the positive psychology approach to coping suggests it to be a more holistic approach by looking at individual events, situations and other related variables in integrated and holistic manner. There is also a difference between the factors and forces that come into play. In the traditional approach, the coping here is a struggle between stressor potency and properties and devising ways and means, which are called strategies, to overcome it. Whereas in the positive psychological approach, there is more to coping than just focusing on input-output factors. It also takes the help of experts to fight it. If all you needed to cope, then all the systematic people with capacity to afford expert consultation would have never been at loss. There's a difference in the approach in terms of causality and explanation. In traditional approach, most of the psychological properties, a nature-nurture tinge, makes coping no different than anything else which is psychological. Whereas in positive psychology approach, the nature-nurture debate is very old. The causality of stress in modern life may be knit technology, connectedness, freedom, isolation, intimacy, etc. in such a manner that only a fresh look at the future can help us understand the realities better. There is a difference in methodological approach to experiential healing paradigm as well. Traditional approaches to coping are more methodological than experiential, whereas positive psychological approaches to coping are more experiential than methodological. The last difference that we see is the scientific overtones. Traditional theories try to locate coping constructs within prevalent and popular psychological paradigms like psychoanalysis or biological approach, whereas in the positive psychology realm, the new age researchers are amalgamating spirituality, philosophy, science, theology, etc. to develop an integrated and, most importantly, interdisciplinary field of positive psychology. Hence, from a positive psychology perspective, coping is not just an individual's conscious effort to deal with the stressor that threatens his equilibrium, but it is also a sense of faith and belief in one's ability to deal with a potential stressor. In true life, we are not always able to deal with the stressor, as it might be more powerful than our abilities to deal with it. Think of an entrepreneur who is receiving a hostile bid from a fierce competitor. A good coping strategy is to avoid the bid by summoning all the resources that he has, while a better strategy might be to benefit from the bid to appreciate the company's shares. Another way to cope in this situation might be a proactive coping approach in which there is a preparedness from the beginning to deal with such hostilities. And sometimes the takeovers, stressors are not bad at all, although they may perceive to be so. Coping is complex and so is its definition. Let's see one of the most scholarly definitions of coping and try to understand it further. Let's first understand how does the process of coping work. The process of coping is dynamic and associative in a sense that the efforts that we employ in dealing with a demanding situation keep changing in nature, and the quality depends upon the situation, and there are several other factors which complexly interplay and define the coping process. A simplified model of coping process was proposed by Carr in 2004. He suggests that a person's personal system like his resources, abilities, etc., and the environmental system, which includes social support, noise, etc., are mediated by his life crisis and transitions, which will in turn determine the kind of appraisal and coping strategies that he or she will resort in response to the stimuli which turns out to be demanding or taxing for him. The coping and appraisal mechanisms sometimes begin so close that they appear to begin simultaneously. However, logically, coping should always follow appraisal. There are two types of appraisal, primary and secondary. In case of primary appraisal, the person assesses two aspects of the stressor. One, its motivational relevance, and second, its motivational congruence. Both the aspects are defined in terms of the need of the person. Let's think of Buddha deciding to leave his palace to salvage the world from misery. The stressor or threat here could be that he might fail. Anyway, that's an impossible task. But then Buddha might have asked himself, is failure relevant to me? No. I want to do something that I can be at peace with myself. And if it comes at the cost of my failure, then I'm ready to pay it. Buddha finds motivational relevance. Now, Buddha also asks another question to himself. Is failure congruent with my deeds? Read it as salvation for world. And he answers no. I'll guide myself. Buddha finds motivational congruence. Once appraisal is done, we move to coping. But sometimes they may appear side by each other as previously said. Let's continue with Buddha's example and try to understand coping strategies by that metaphor. The challenge for Buddha continues, as now he has to finally find a way that puts an end to his miseries. He has gone so far to overcome his fears of failure and renounced worldly life. There could be three types of coping strategies that one can resort to. First, problem-focused coping. Second, emotional-focused coping. And third, avoidance-focused coping. According to Carr, all these strategies to cope can be functional and dysfunctional at the same time. In problem-focused coping, the person resorts to a problem-solving strategy, like Buddha did. Buddha is full of rational tenets. He went to forest, meditated for around 49 days and wandered in search of truth for around 6 years and found the 4 noble truths and devised his 8-fold path to deal with it. Another way could be resorting to regulating one's mood rather than focusing on solving the problem. Like when we are in a bad mood, we go for a movie, shop unnecessarily or talk. This is known as emotion-focused coping. Another approach could be avoiding the problem, which is known as avoidance-focused coping. For example, you have an exam tomorrow, you know you're not prepared, but you cannot deal with the stress, so what you do is do everything else besides sitting down to study because you don't want to face the stressor which is coming to you. That's another way of coping. Now, let's understand the various theoretical understanding on coping, especially the psychodynamic and transactional approaches. According to Crone, theories of coping can be broadly classified mainly in 2 ways. One, based on their objective, and the second based on their abstraction applied to their theories. Based on the objective, theories could be trait-oriented or state-oriented. Trait-oriented theories focus on specific traits that individual possess that could render him ineffective or vulnerable while coping with potential threat. Such individuals can be identified early and put to training so that it brings better coping skills to them. In state-oriented coping, the focus is on the strategies employed by individuals and outcome of such strategies. It focuses more on situational warrants and optimal strategies for a particular stressor. The second classification is based on the level of abstraction employed. It has 2 subtypes, microanalytical and macroanalytical. Microanalytical approaches focuses on a large number of specific coping strategies, whereas macroanalytic analysis operates at a higher level of abstraction, thus concentrating on more fundamental constructs. One of the most common and popular approach to coping is to look at it through the glass of psychodynamic perspective. Norma Hann has proposed the idea of ego process. By that, she meant any process employed to solve a problem. According to her, ego processes include coping, defenses, and fragmentation. Coping is a process of addressing the difficulties by taking help of both internal and external resources. The main aim of the 3 processes is to maintain a sense of self-integrating and self-consistency, and the choice of the method depends upon the intensity of stresses, our ability to cope, and many other factors. When sometimes dealing with the help of internal and external resources, it is not possible. Thus, we can indulge in fortification of our existing values and beliefs. It helps us in maintaining self-consistency. However, in certain situations, when fortification is not enough, we may engage in strategies that might consider as adaptive failures, like turning into a psychotic. This is known as fragmentation. What happened to US Marshal Teddy Daniels in the Martin Scorsese movie The Shuttle was an adaptive failure. Sigmund Freud has also considered the defense mechanisms as the foremost ways of coping with different stressors. He offered a large number of defense mechanisms like repression, rationalization, displacement, etc. that one would employ in everyday life to varying degrees to deal with stressors. An over-reliance on such defense mechanisms ultimately lead to psychologically unhealthy personality, according to him. In contrast to psychodynamic model, transactional model presumes more rational and conscious response to potential stressor. The transactional model believes that we consciously weigh the pros and cons of varying coping strategies like problem-focused, emotion-focused, and avoidance-focused. So, would you make primary and secondary appraisal when you're standing nearby World Trade Tower building and the terrorist struck it? Probably you will run for your life first. That is an avoidance-focused coping. However, the problem with this approach seems that it focuses more on transactional aspects, trade-offs, and parsimonious capacities of individuals, which may sound unrealistic in several situations. Now, After understanding what coping is, what are its various aspects and how is it related to psychology and defined by various thoughts of psychology, we now look into the various applications of positive coping in everyday life. You all will agree that stress is a part of our everyday life and so is coping. But unfortunately, positive coping is not part of our everyday behavioral repertoire. For example, whenever we get stress from work or life, we either take a vacation or go for a movie or do something to keep our mind off it. This kind of behavior is avoidant coping and not positive coping. There are a large number of books and scholars who have discussed in detail about the coping mechanism for clinical as well as non-clinical problems and various hassles of life. Hence, we need to briefly look at them from a perspective of positive psychology. Of all the issues of modern life, stress is one of the most experienced processes. A search query on coping with stress gives 1.4 million results in Google Books and over 1.6 million results in Google Scholar. A truly positive way of coping would be harnessing your negative energies in a positive manner, turning your anger, stress, and defeating thoughts and schemas into a winning benchmark for you. How? You must have known about the case of Nolaya Kyrgios. If you're not, let's quickly take you to the story about Nolaya Kyrgios. Nolaya Kyrgios, the 19-year-old amateur tennis player who harnessed his anger over his mom to defeat world champion Rafael Nadal to reach the quarterfinals on his debut appearance at the All England Club. After toppling Nadal sensationally by 7-6, 5-7, 7-6, 6-3, Kyrgios in an interview with Reuters attributed his secret to success to his anger over her mother for her praise for Nadal and doubt in his abilities. This doubt in his abilities for her son led him to so much of anger that he could ever challenge Nadal in the manner that he did. According to the report, he says, and I quote, "I saw in an interview that my mum thought Rafael was too good for me, so that it made me a little angry." World number 144, Kyrgios told reporters that anger fired up him so much so that from the moment he swaggered onto center court, bopping his head to the music blaring out of his pink headphones, he looked like a man possessed. He did not care a lot about what one of the all-time greats of the sport had achieved. The entire Australian tyro cared about was that he possessed the belief and the talent to prolong the best week of my life by turning Nadal out of the grass court major. This was done in July 2013. So you could see that there are certain aspects of us which could be negative, but we could try and use them to put them in positive use, put them into positive energy so that they could be of further use to us than damage us. This was an example which could be an extreme. You could also say this is an exception than a norm. But in our lives, all of us can look within and see there are several times when we are challenged, when we are complained, when we are pitched against people. And instead of taking it to our heart, getting hopeless about it, getting angry about it, we can use this kind of an emotion to challenge ourselves to meet up to the threat or expectation that has been thrown at us. This is a more positive way of reacting to a stressor. Apart from this example, past and present are also replete with examples where people have risen against all odds and doubts to find them into a transformed being. They not only overcame the stress and difficulties, but also used their negative energies in a more positive manner. In fact, that only true differentiator between good and evil is that good people are good at channelizing their negative energies more effectively. If we believe in Sigmund Freud's theory of personality, then all of us possess a disproportionately large store of negative energies, and our daily life is unfortunately also full of many hassles and stress of varying types. Then, can we afford to ignore that overwhelmingly large negative store of personality? Of course not. We can have a two-pronged coping strategy where strategic coping mechanisms like problem-focused approaches are used to rationally understand and solve the external and internal threats. Also, we can also harness our negative energies for positive outcomes, like how Norlilac Igrios did. For this, we require self-possession and mindfulness things, which we've already discussed in one of the positive psychology classes. Some of the examples that we can look within our Hindu mythology, within our Indian mythology, is of Karna. Karna was considered to be a Sutputra, not fit to be playing with or competing with or learning arms, knowledge of arms as equivalent to the Kshatriyas. But he made sure that the way he was discriminated, he became the best of the warriors of those times. So many times you would be coming across a situation where your own perceived threat would be higher than what people expect you to perform. You have to rise above rise above the ashes like phoenix, and that's where coping will help you. In the end, let's try and summarize what we have learned so far. Coping is a process of addressing the difficulties by taking help of both internal and external resources. Coping is defined as a sum of cognitive and behavioral efforts which are constantly changing that aim to handle particular demands, whether internal or external. Those are viewed as taxing or demanding. The traditional approaches to coping also adopts a reductionist view where both cause and effect can be understood in terms of smaller units of mechanism, while positive psychology of coping bring more holistic approach to coping by looking at individuals, events, situations and other related variables in integrated and holistic manner. According to cognitive appraisal, we make appraisal of the situation while selecting a response to the situation. Whereas in case of primary appraisal, the person assesses two aspects of the stressor. One, its motivational relevance, and second, its motivational congruence. Secondary appraisal refers to appraisal of the organism's ability to cope with the consequences of stressor. As we have studied, there are three types of coping strategies: problem-focused coping, emotion-focused coping, and avoidance-focused coping. The two sets of theories which have helped us understand coping better are trait theories of coping, which focus on specific traits that individual possesses that could render him ineffective or vulnerable while coping with a potential threat. In the state-oriented coping, the focus is on the strategies employed by the individual and outcome of such strategies. According to classical psychoanalytical theory of Sigmund Freud, the defense mechanisms are the foremost way of coping with different stressors. Freud offered a large number of defense mechanisms like repression, rationalization, etc. that one may employ in everyday life to varying degrees to deal with stressors. Thus, as you have studied, coping is something that we all engage in whenever we are confronted with a threatening situation. But what kind of mechanism do we employ, how effective it is for our well-being is something that we need to learn, unlearn each time. As said in the outset itself, coping is a dynamic process, so it needs to evolve with each kind of situation or stimuli that we face. Hope this helps you learn coping better, not only from a theoretical perspective, but also for your personal life.